Now, dear, you know I can't let in Slytherins. Not without the password. I'm not asking you to just let me in. You can talk to people on the other side, right? Can you ask someone to tell Hermione I'm here? Don't bother. Doria jumped. She hadn't noticed the girl show up. The newcomer was young, probably a first year, dressed in Muggle-style jeans and jumper, with a freckled face and bright red-orange hair. Ginevra Weasley, maybe. Doria knew she existed, but they'd never met. Hidden Warbler. With a florid, hand-swirling bow, the portrait detached from the wall, folding out as though on a hinge. The hall was suddenly full of chattering and laughter, pouring through a round little passage, now revealed cut through the wall. She couldn't see much, but from here, the Gryffindor common room looked red. Very red. Weasley swept past Doria, hesitated with her foot on the lip of the passage. Turning back to look over her shoulder, one pale eyebrow cocked, she said, "You coming?" "Oh, Doria had come up to Gryffindor to meet Hermione a few times, but she'd never actually gone inside. She'd always assumed that wouldn't go over well. Gryffindors and Slytherins didn't tend to get along. "I'd better not. Could you find Hermione for me, though?" "Don't be such a sop. Come on." The girl grabbed Doria by the wrist and pulled her toward the passage. Well, okay then. It turned out the Gryffindor common room was, in fact, very red. The poofy stuffed armchairs and sofas here and there, the carpets, the cloth hung up in place of wallpaper. Mages tended to prefer tapestries for that purpose. Even the wood of the chairs and tables. The ceiling was painted red, bits of gold glimmering here and there across the room. That was a lot of red. It was almost too much red, honestly. It was a little overwhelming. More than a few glances from the Gryffindors sitting here and there turned her direction. But most were too distracted by their own things to mind, or even notice. One little Slytherin walking into their midst. All of them together, producing an almost offensively loud din of chatter and laughter. Even a game of exploding snap going on in the middle of the floor. A radio blaring over the noise. It never got this noisy in the Slytherin common room. The prefects, and probably Snape, would have hexed people for making this much of a nuisance of themselves long before it could get to this point. But Doria guessed this was why Slytherin was Slytherin, and Gryffindor was Gryffindor. Her appearance didn't go entirely unremarked upon, though. She and the red-headed girl, still dragging Doria along by the wrist, were about halfway through the room when a boy came up. Doria didn't recognize him by sight. He was probably a third or fourth year. "Weasley, what are you doing bringing in a..." The Weasley girl flipped him the bird, growled, "Piss off, arseface. It's none of your business." He was so blindsided at a tiny little first-year girl talking to him like that, he couldn't immediately respond. The two of them were the rest of the way across the room before he recovered. Doria was right there with him. The Weasleys could be a bit much, but the one in her year, or even the twins, didn't talk to people like that. There was a barely perceptible tingle of magic on the air as they stepped onto the stairs. Each of their rooms in Slytherin had separate wards, but she knew all the Gryffindors in a year shared the same room. It felt like they'd just warded the stairs and called it good. Weasley continued to drag her up the stairs, past one landing, and then a second, before abruptly turning onto a smaller landing she'd hardly even noticed, stepping through a narrow door and out. Doria blinked. They were on a balcony, rather narrow, hugging the curve of the tower, looking down over the body of the castle below them, the grounds beyond, the mountains framing the valley. It was pretty, but cold. Doria often thought the castle was far too cold, but this was even worse. She had the vague feeling it should be colder. There must be environmental wards on the balcony. But they didn't cut out the December chill entirely. Icy wind slicing through her clothes and tugging at her hair. The girl, finally letting go of her wrist, pulled out her wand and gave it an easy, casual swish. And suddenly, the cold was replaced with a pleasant, soft heat, warmer than the common room below even, she thought, despite the few crackling hearths she'd spotted along the walls. Doria was temporarily distracted from her confusion and irritation, staring at the girl. That was really very good for a first year. And she'd even cast it silently. Doria doubted Liz could have done that. Returning her wand to its place up her sleeve, Weasley gave her a warm, crooked smile. "Sorry about pulling you out like this, but I've been meaning to talk to you for a while, and this seemed like a good opportunity." Somehow, Doria managed to hold in a sigh. She'd been pulled aside by one student or another more times than she could count this year, with transparently political motivations most of the time. People in one noble family or another wanting to introduce and or ingratiate themselves, too, with the new Lady Black. She'd gotten the feeling many were uncertain whether she'd actually inherit. But now that it was official, they were finally getting to introductions that should have been made ages ago. It was a little odd that a Weasley, and the youngest Weasley, usually this was a job for the eldest in the family available, would be doing this sort of thing. But whatever. It's no trouble, Miss Weasley. I do need to talk to Hermione anyway, and I couldn't have gotten in without you. Gin, please. Okay. Doria. The girl smiled then, a look crossing her face. They couldn't seem to decide whether it was shy or sly, which was a weird contrast. She said, "So, you're Liz Potter's best friend, right?" And that was not a question she'd expected to hear, at least not right away. You could say that, I guess. She doubted Liz would put it that way. But, is this about Liz? It is. It occurred to me, I don't really know that much about her. At least, Gin said, her lips tilting into a rueful smirk. Beyond what's in books, and I have the feeling those are mostly full of shite. Doria scoffed. Well, you're not wrong about that. Liz has a policy of refusing to read anything that mentions her, because it's always nonsense, which means there are some defense books she can't touch. And it's pretty much impossible to read any history covering the last decade or so. Yeah. I've noticed she doesn't seem to like being the girl who lived much. Gin leaned back against the railing, one knee bending to prop one foot against a post, her hands stuck in her pockets. Or, that's my reading of it anyway. Most Gryffindors seem to think she's a stuck-up little bint who thinks she's just too good for everyone else. Doria didn't bother answering, just rolled her eyes very expressively. Gin giggled, shaking her head. Yeah, I thought so. I did think it odd, though, that someone who'd grown up with that kind of fame would have such poor regard for it. I still don't quite understand Liz, I think. She didn't grow up with it, Daria grumbled, and then realized what she was saying, bit her lip. There was something odd going on here, but she didn't know what it was, and Gin was calling her Liz. But nobody else called her that. Only the people who actually knew her, and Daria had never seen this girl around before. Oh? I would have thought Dumbledore would tell her all about it when she was growing up. Ignoring for now the niggling feeling that something was wrong, Daria forced out a huff. Dumbledore didn't have anything to do with her when she was little. Really? But everyone says. Liz didn't meet him until the summer before first year, and it was not a pleasant meeting. That actually seemed to surprise Gin, her smile fading and her eyes widening a bit. I hadn't realized that. Her face slipping into a suspicious frown, she asked, "What happened?" Daria opened her mouth to answer, and then stopped herself. Suddenly enough, she actually bit her tongue a little. "I'm sorry, but I can't tell you that. There are things Liz doesn't want to get around." "Well, I'm hardly likely to tell anyone, am I? You might not have known this, but I don't have a whole lot in the way of friends." Daria had heard about that, actually, that the youngest Weasley spent a lot of time with her nose in a book, or else hexing people who annoyed her. She'd overheard Ronald complaining about how weird and abrasive she'd gotten lately, and some of the things the first-year Slytherins and Hufflepuffs said about her were much worse. But that didn't really matter. They were Liz's secrets. Secrets she hadn't wanted to tell Daria in the first place. She wouldn't just go around spilling them. But she wanted to. She wanted to tell Gin all about it. How Liz's family were terrible. How Dumbledore had completely fucked up where she was concerned. She wanted someone to do something about it. Her best friend had been abused and was literally homeless. And she didn't know what to. Daria wanted to tell her. She really did. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, her stomach sinking. Something was wrong. This wasn't right. She didn't. I really shouldn't. I won't tell anyone. Gin's face went softer, a shade of concern crossing her face. And when I think about it, well, if nothing else, these attacks prove Dumbledore is less than perfect. And I heard about Quirrell last year. And Dumbledore doesn't even have a great track record where Liz in particular is concerned, does he? It's worse than you think. Her head tilting, Gin prompted. Oh? Staring out over the grounds. She couldn't look at her. She shouldn't be doing this. This wasn't right. Daria bit her lip, the words rising like steam, pressure building in her chest. Finally, she blurted out, "He left her with her family." I hadn't realized Liz had any family left, aside from you, of course. Technically, Draco was just as closely related to Liz as Daria was. Daria's grandmother and Draco's grandfather were siblings, and Liz's grandmother was their father's sister. Daria and Draco were second cousins, and they were both Liz's second cousins once removed. Although Daria's grandfather was also Liz's grandmother's first cousin once removed, so Daria was Liz's second and third cousin once removed, because purebloods and incest. Daria remembered feeling slightly uncomfortable when she'd realized her grandmother had been a Black before marrying her grandfather. Apparently, that wasn't even particularly unusual, Black incest jokes had supposedly been kind of a thing. But that wasn't really the point, was it? It wasn't like either of them had actually been raised by anyone related to each other anyway. Her mother's family. Her mother had a sister. After that, Halloween Liz was sent to stay with them. Gin blinked. I thought Liz's mother was Muggle-born. She was. Liz was raised by Muggles. Though raised was a very charitable way to refer to it. I see. All traces of a smile, all the warmth that had been in her eyes. It had all vanished. The girl staring at Liz, hard and serious. The green blue of her eyes, cold as ice. It was honestly a little creepy. Reminded her of Cassiopeia, abruptly switching from playing the role of a cheerful, vapid society lady back to her darker, quieter self. Did Dumbledore bring her letter then? There was something more on the words, a weight of meaning Doria couldn't read. Gin thinking of something unsaid. That's just the thing. Nerves tingling along her fingers and the back of the neck. This was wrong. Something was wrong. She shouldn't be talking about this. The words nonetheless spilled past her lips. Frustrations built up over the last year and a half, bursting free. Liz hadn't known about any of this. Liz got the standard letter that all the magically raised kids did. I think McGonagall or whoever just assumed she would have known about magic growing up. But she didn't. Her family didn't tell her anything. Liz didn't even know her mom had been magic at all until she read it out of her aunt's head, the day her Hogwarts letter turned up. Liz used the opportunity of learning she had somewhere to go to run away from home. Because, hey, mind magic makes these things easy. And they're awful, terrible people. So why not, right? Of course, people notice if the girl who lived is staying alone at a hotel somewhere. Dumbledore showed up and dragged her back to her abusive relatives with a lecture about using her abilities to protect herself from them. Dumbledore didn't do shite for Liz. She hates the man, and for good bloody reason. Doria paused to catch her breath for a moment. Gin was still staring at her, cold and still, her eyes gone wide, and, wait, what the hell was happening? Oh God, Doria yelped, her hand jumping up to cover her mouth. I shouldn't have said that. Why did I didn't mean to. You can't tell anyone. Nobody can know about this. Especially Liz. She was already annoyed with her. But if she knew Doria was going around blabbing about her private affairs, she would be so angry. How did that even happen? That shouldn't have happened. Doria was not this ... in cautious comma. Something wasn't right. Jerkily, Gin twitched back into motion, her face pulling into a shaky, obviously forced smile. It's all right. I won't tell anyone. I understand how difficult it must have been. All these awful things, keeping them to yourself, with nobody to talk to. I know how hard that can be. Well, yes, it had been very frustrating and rather depressing. That was true. But that wasn't really an excuse, was it? She still shouldn't have. Frowning to herself, something about her voice, thick and harsh. Thunder from a distant storm, a rumble barely heard. Gin said, slow and drawling, So, you're telling me, not only did Dumbledore circumvent the established legal process in such cases to leave his precious prophesied savior in an abusive home, and he had nobody check up on her in all that time, but he forced her back. after getting some impression of how bad it was. I can't imagine Liz would have told Dumbledore about compelling her relatives voluntarily. As far as I know, yes, that's exactly what happened. Although Doria didn't know anything about a prophesied savior, she assumed Gin was just being poetic. Well, that certainly explains a lot, doesn't it? It did, though Doria didn't know what exactly Gin was referring to. I assumed I would find the light ascendant, the girl who lived, cultivated as a symbol of their power, the inevitability of their victory. Gin shook her head, facing away from Doria to smile ruefully over the valley. They've cultivated the symbol, obviously, but they've seemingly forgotten to cultivate the person at all. And it looks like Dumbledore managed to alienate her in short order. So thoroughly, the children from light families already see her as a traitor, and their enmity will only drive her further away. Dumbledore handed the dark a cultural victory through his own sheer incompetence. And now that he knows he's made a mistake, it's already too late to do anything about it. It'd be hilarious if it weren't so pathetic. What? She meant Gin wasn't wrong exactly. Now that she pointed it out, it did seem inevitable that Liz would drift toward common fate, or maybe even ars publica, which would be an upset for the light, to lose their own hero to the opposition. Doria hadn't quite thought about it that way, but it was obvious now. This could easily become a significant victory for the dark in the cultural Cold War sort of thing they'd had going on for a century now, recouping some of the damage done to the popular image of the dark during the rise and fall of the Dark Lord. She didn't know why Gin was talking about this, where this was coming from. Doria didn't understand this conversation at all. She had no idea what was happening right now. This made no sense. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. The feeling just out of reach. Well, I have one last question for you, Doria. Gin stopped leaning on the guardrail, stepped closer to Doria. The smile was gone from her face, flat and cold and empty. Some instinctive impulse had her wanting to back away, but Doria couldn't move, her body somehow feeling too far away. Gin's eyes bright and arresting. They say Ellie Potter is special somehow, that her defeat of the Dark Lord is due to some innate ability of hers. I've heard a competing theory involving self-sacrificial ritual magic, presumably performed by Lily Evans. Tell me, Doria, which do you think is more likely? Her lips numb, seeming to move on their own, she said, "It wasn't Liz. I don't know what happened that night. Maybe Lily did something, but I know it wasn't Liz." "You're certain? Why?" "She's just a girl." Doria felt tears prick at her eyes, but she wasn't certain why, her head too filled with confused fuzz to straighten it out. Liz doesn't even believe it was her, that it must have been something her mom did. She's powerful, sure, and she's a mind mage, but there isn't anything, miraculous about her. She's just a girl. Gin was smiling now, bright and cheerful. And so she is. Interesting. The fuzz slowly fell away, Doria blinking to herself, wiping at her eyes. What the hell just happened? Had she just... It never ceases to amaze me how the light construct the devices of their own destruction, again and again, elevating false symbols with no substance behind them, fabricating lie after manipulation, building a promise of justice they never intend to enforce. Time after time, the same story of oaths made in bad faith, inviting the retaliation of those they've betrayed, time after time. I expect them to learn, but they never do. It's astounding. It truly is. Drea wasn't really listening, instead just staring. Somehow, she managed to restrain the urge to pull her wand. She was a trash duelist. She wouldn't stand a chance. What did you do to me? Mind magic. It had to be mind magic. Except Liz had never compelled her like that. She hadn't even realized. Gin smiled, warm and kind, which, given the circumstances, sent shivers down Dorea's spine. Why, what a question that is. I didn't do anything to you, Dorea. That was a load of shite. It had been slow and subtle enough she hadn't noticed until it was too late. But They came up to the final landing, and Dorea paused for a moment, catching her breath. The stairs in the rest of the castle were bloody awful sometimes, but were the little towers Gryffindor had put their dorm rooms in really necessary? Apparently, Ravenclaw was just as bad. She'd never been so glad she'd been put in Slytherin. Hermione's in there, I'm pretty sure, Gin said, nodding at the door, casually slouching, her hands in her pockets. Didn't look even the slightest bit winded by all the bloody stairs. Dorea nodded. Well, thanks for letting me in. The younger girl smiled at her, slightly crooked, her eyes almost seeming to dance with hidden laughter. It was slightly creepy, honestly. Except it wasn't really. She seemed perfectly normal. Nice enough, if a little more brash than pure-blood girls tended to be. And yet, Dorea could hardly meet her eyes, a cold shiver running down her spine, the hairs at the back of her neck standing up. What was wrong with her? Anytime. The password will be different when we come back after the holiday. If Hermione won't give it to you, just ask me. See you around, Dorea. Gin turned and sauntered off, vanishing down the stairs. Dorea watched her go for a moment, frowning to herself. She felt like she couldn't think of the word for something, or that feeling she'd forgotten to pack something, but she couldn't imagine what. She was missing something to do with Gin Weasley. She couldn't think of what. And then the picture suddenly snapped into clarity, like puzzle pieces fitting together. The attacks did make sense. The target was Dumbledore. Dumbledore's greatest, most consistent support in the Wizengamot came from the light, more ambivalently from common fate. And he was all big on championing Muggle-born rights, greater protections for Muggles and the like. Whoever it was, they'd attacked a Muggle-born, a pureblood of Ars Britannia, a light-aligned faction, and a pureblood of the light. And in failing to protect his allies, in failing to prevent the attacks from continuing, in failing to even find anything to point at a perpetrator, he was failing his allies, proving their faith in him was misplaced. The light didn't particularly care about wilderfolk or squibs, but if she assumed Mrs. Norris had been petrified by accident, or perhaps simply to cover the culprit's tracks, if they were aware she was wilder folk and could inform on them, it all made sense. The kids who'd been attacked, it wasn't really about them. It was about Dumbledore. It did make sense. Dorea was certain she'd figured it out. But she wasn't certain how she'd figured it out. Something must have clued her in, but oh well, that wasn't really important just this second, she guessed. Shaking off her distracted thoughts, Doria turned to the door into Hermione's room, raised her hand to knock. They had plans for the holiday to coordinate. The inexplicable creepiness of a certain little redhead was even more unimportant. Doria put Gin Weasley out of mind entirely.